Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I apologise for chancing my arm with my earlier intervention. I'll have to find another opportunity when you're not looking to make the same point. Could I join with the general feeling of the House in congratulating the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent South in bringing this debate forward. It's always good to have a lengthy debate about rural affairs in this House, and particularly in quite sort of measured conditions. In a sense, I suppose I ought to start by declaring a bit of an interest, because in the 10 years before I was elected to this House, I was involved in I think the largest European group with an interest in rural affairs, that being the ever excellent Countryside Alliance. And the reason I mention that is this is actually all about people. And sometimes we forget, when we're in this building, I suspect, and in other parliaments too, that there is always a consequence on communities and individuals and jobs, which the Honourable Member for North Antrim was very accurate in portraying. And so it's on those points that I shall restrict my speech to. And I hope the House will also forgive me perhaps going not into quite as much detail as my honourable friend, the member for Bury, in trying to deal with different aspects of the bill. I'd also like to start, Mr Deputy Speaker, by bigging it up for our farmers, because I think actually over the last 10 or 20 years they sometimes get, and undeservedly so, a pretty bad press. I think farmers, in particular farmers in my area in Carmarthen, West and South Pembrokeshire, members of the Farmers Union of Wales, members of NFU Cymru, members of the CLA, have actually been in the vanguard of sustainable land use and food production for much longer than it has become fashionable to talk about it in this House. And they don't often get the praise that they deserve for the fantastic work they do in producing good quality food and also maintaining the landscape as we expect to find it when we visit the countryside, and often at no cost, of course.
When the Honourable Friend has been having his discussions with farmers in his constituency, have they ever, any one of them, ever expressed a desire to receive more direction how to do their job from the Secretary of State?
The Honourable Member for his intervention, I think he probably knows the answer before I give it, which is, of course, no. But it's not no in an aggressive sense. It is simply no, give us a chance to compete on an equal playing field, a level playing field, not only with other farmers across Europe and the world, but other industries in the UK. It's not actually about special pleading. It's simply pleading to be treated in a similar manner to everybody else. And this, of course, this bill, I think contributes to a suspicion that this is about Parliament, this is about individual members of Parliament attempting to do something to the agricultural industry rather than for the agricultural industry. And if there has been a problem over a long period of time, it's that sort of latent suspicion hanging around everything we do as being in our interests rather than their interests. Of course, I give way.
Does the Honourable Member not accept that there's a bit of a trade-off involved here? The UK agricultural industry benefits from billions of pounds of subsidies from UK taxpayers. Does he not think that the UK taxpayers that aren't involved in the farming industry have a right to express an opinion on how farming in this country is conducted? And if they feel that it's important that higher environmental standards are met, then that's a perfectly valid point for them to make.
Thank you for that comment. Yes, I do agree. I think it's perfectly reasonable, and I think if you look at the evidence, it is quite clear that nobody within agriculture or food production would disagree with you. Indeed, they have actually been making this point, I suspect, for longer than you and I have. It's all about fairness, to use a phrase which is becoming rather fashionable also just at the moment. But on that very point, can I make one particular comment? Actually, the reason that we have a countryside and an industry which is, I suspect, the envy of Europe, is actually not because of politicians, it is despite politicians. And the member for Bury North, who's just left his place, raised that in his intervention quite accurately. We actually have to be very, very careful that in passing legislation, I suspect as it affects rural Britain and agriculture in particular, we are simply not contributing to a more complicated and therefore less competitive agricultural industry, and not achieving the benefits which quite reasonably the promoters of this bill set out to achieve.
thank you. I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And on the particular point that the lady opposite makes, does my honourable friend agree with me that indeed much of those subsidised payments that she refers to are in fact given for biodiversity, for stewardship, taking great care of the environment that the farms farm?
I do. And I think that that has been a very visible shift, if you like, in the subsidy policy over the last 10 or 20 years. That instead of subsidies simply for food production's sake, it has moved much more obviously towards environmental stewardship. But the point I was trying to make is, let's not assume for one moment that environmental stewardship was not something that farmers across all aspects of agriculture, not just food production, took extremely seriously and value and have been part of because they feel it is their duty not only to their own farms but to the community. That has always been the case, and yet it gets lost in these debates, and somehow there is this underlying view that we have to make farmers take environmental stewardship seriously. Actually, that is not the case. Farmers that I know take environmental stewardship extremely seriously, and the only barrier between them and successful environmental stewardship has generally been politicians. It hasn't been their own particular desire to make money at the cost of the environment. And I think if I was to shine a bright light at the member for Stoke-on-Trent South, as far as his bill is concerned, it is that surely any decent Secretary of State of whatever party would automatically insert into their thinking, if not their legislation, all these checks and balances that we're told are now so essential that they have to be enshrined in law. Certainly, I have to ask the question, why over the last 13, 15, 20 years has it not been the case that successive Secretaries of State for DEFRA and its predecessor MAF have not actually done this as a matter of routine? And I recall the creation of something called the Rural Advocate under the last government. And the Rural Advocate's job, I'm not even sure to my great shame whether he still exists, but the Rural Advocate's job was to oversee a sort of rural proofing exercise to ensure that any legislation, not just passed by the by DEFRA, but by any government department, passed the test as far as rural communities were concerned. So my criticism is that actually perhaps this is, at this stage at any rate, a far too narrow line of attack. And what I wanted to move on to, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is this vexed question of sustainability. And it is difficult, I think, to necessarily define it as accurately as we might like in the context of this debate. And it is tempting, I suspect, for members, particularly new members, to resist the chance of objecting to anything which has sustainability in the title, because somehow we will be seen as regressive or a sort of a dinosaur if we do. But most of us have come under a certain amount of sort of heavy bombardment over the last few weeks, as far as this bill is concerned, from various pressure groups, some with more compelling arguments than others. But there have been three particular people who probably pushed me as close as I was happy to go with regard to support for this measure. One was my honourable friend, the member from Richmond Park, whose opinion I value on every subject, but we can't just quite agree on this one. The late night lobbying I received last night from Mr. Hugh Fernley-Whittingstall, but even his persuasive argument, including the possible promise of a river cottage hamper for Christmas if I was to change my mind, was insufficient. And also the fantastic efforts of and unique lobbying skills of Mr. Stanley Johnson up in the public gallery today. But even the combined heavy bombardment of those three very expert and very individuals who I respect greatly failed to convince me that we are anywhere near defining sustainability as well as we might for the purposes of this bill becoming an act. And
will the honourable gentleman give way?
I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I agree that sustainability is a much abused word, but would he not agree that sustainability certainly involves both economic, social and environmental concerns, both here in this country and around the world?
I do, and I think we sometimes forget that there is a strong element of social and economic, sort of ingredient to that particular definition. And I do think it is missing so far in this debate. I'm sure the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent will tell us that we have got that wrong, but I've seen nothing and heard nothing from all the hundreds of emails that we've had so far, which does anything to convince me that your point has been properly addressed. And just to expand on that, I think that it's odd, for example, that this bill focuses purely on livestock production. It seems obvious to me that if we're to talk about sustainable farming, we shouldn't restrict ourselves purely to livestock, and I'm not convinced that the bill has been properly considered in that respect. It seems odd to me, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we haven't properly examined the fact that, if I was to pluck one example, no pun intended, from the sky, and that being poultry production, that there is an argument that intensive poultry production has less of a adverse carbon footprint than extensive poultry production, and that has not been addressed. Nor, Mr Deputy Speaker, have consumer purchasing habits been addressed until the member for North Antrim raised them. There is a reference in the bill to rural resilience. I don't know what rural resilience is in the context of this bill, but I do know that rural resilience is something which I have been extremely familiar with over 10 years. And actually, the resilience of the rural community is far away from being a satisfactory excuse to impose yet further burden of regulation on the rural community. We cannot possibly just simply depend on the resilience of our friends in the livestock industry for the purposes of this bill. We've not talked, I suspect, in any great detail about the possible adverse effects of the uncompetitive position that this would put our livestock producers in. And there was one reference, and only one, this morning to profit. A sort of dirty word, it seems, when we come to talking about sustainability. But unless there is profit in farming, unless there is the sort of profit which enables farmers to invest long-term as opposed to short-term, then there will be no sustainability of any sort. No environmental sustainability, no social sustainability, and no economic sustainability. And there was a famous bumper sticker which was being put about by the Americans a year or so ago, which quite simply said, "No farmers, no food." And we overlook this sustainability question and the long-term profitability of farming at our peril. And yet, whilst there has been a bit of a debate about intensive dairy units and what number of cows constitutes unacceptability, it seems to me interesting that at long last there are people out there who are prepared to consider investing several £1 million in UK agriculture. We have been striving for generations to persuade people to do this, and the moment somebody comes up with a cost-effective way of doing so, we fall upon them like a pack of wolves and start to stop them doing so. We've got to be careful about being carried away by a scare story dreamt up.
I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Gentleman, but as I listen to him, I wonder if he's talking about the same bill that I've been looking at, because one of the central themes of the bill is to actually try and reduce the dependency on imported meat and the risks of practices that happen outside this country. I'd have thought that's a major defence of British farming, and I'm surprised he doesn't support that.
I think we are reading the same bill, but it does strike me as odd that 1,000 livestock producers in my own part of West Wales, not a single one has written to me suggesting that I support this measure. Not one of 1,000 livestock producers. Is that an intervention? Well, I suspect the promoters of the bill are the ones responsible for explaining it to the people that it affects. And my earlier comments about us having to be careful that all legislation is not seen in some way to over-regulate and therefore uncompetitivize our farming industry must be taken seriously. But in his favour, though, I would say that the aspirational elements of this are to be congratulated, and I think it's fair to say that there are a number of people across the House who might not be able to support the bill today, but support those aspirational elements of it, particularly local procurement for institutions like the NHS or the MOD, and indeed it was, I think, in the Conservative Party manifesto before the election that would be a measure that we would pursue, and perhaps the Minister could expand on that. Equally, there are, as we've heard, a number of environmental schemes which farmers are enthusiastically sort of signing up to, with the possible exception of Glastier in Wales, which has proved to be a sort of bureaucratic nightmare, unlike its excellent predecessor. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to conclude, I just really want to deal with the question of balance. Because with all of these things, it is very difficult, and I accept this, to strike the right balance between encouraging and generating economic sustainability within the farming industry, which in my opinion at any rate leads to environmental sustainability, with the interests of those who wish to use the land for non-agricultural, non-food production purposes. The striking the right balance with those who have a duty to produce good quality and affordable food, and those who've got very sensible and measured and worthy environmental considerations. And perhaps my greatest concern is this legislation doesn't seem, on the face of it, to strike that balance. And whilst it quite rightly puts the focus of responsibility on the Secretary of State and on the politicians, it doesn't actually, I think, deal with it in a way which, if enshrined in law, would be fair or reasonable or balanced. But it is good to see something which if you like, regulates us rather than regulates farmers. And yet, but as I say, it's not quite in the right condition yet. And for that reason, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think it is impossible for anybody who has a real interest in striking this balance and a real interest in supporting rural communities' desire to be economically, socially and environmentally sustainable and responsible. It is impossible for us, at least on this occasion, to support this measure.